although he was, just to say to you, I see the recording thing has come through. We are recording the session, and I hope everyone else is okay with it. And I think you might get something up coming up on the screen to say got it. So getting back to Professor Vellem, died somewhat unexpectedly on the 3rd of December 2019. Although he was sick for a greater part of 2019, I least expected it to end in the way it did. I was really distraught when Pumisa called me on the day that he passed to say that he was gone. And I remember very vividly that I was driving actually at that point in time, and I picked it up on the phone speakerphone. And I was so disheveled actually at that news that I actually had to pull off the road just to digest and come to terms with the reality of death of a friend and colleague. VUYANI and I go back a long way, as many of you, I suppose, on this platform. And our work together in the church of the United Presbyterian Church was really a great opportunity for us to get to know each other very personally. Apart from the number of different committees and so forth in which we served, at one time I was the moderator of the General Assembly, and VUYANI at that time was the General Secretary of the church. And so you can imagine that we spent a lot of time together, traveling both nationally and internationally, and in so many different meetings and forums of the church. And so we really got to know each other exceptionally well during that time. And therefore he became a very good friend, somebody that I could really talk to, and we could connect on a number of different issues and topics that we were working together on in the church. But also I knew him particularly as a colleague when he joined the University of Pretoria before I did. And he was part of the Faculty of Theology and Religion in the Department of Systematics and Historical Theology, but at that time it was called Systematics and Christian Ethics. He was also the pioneer and director of the very first Center for Public Theology, something that he had a vision for and something that he implemented. And this too changed with time. Since last year in 2020, the three centers that we had at the university merged to form a new center known as the Center for Faith and Community. And the Center for Faith and Community, director of which is Professor Stefan De Beer, joining me on this platform to actually have made this particular lecture to become possible at this point in time. So with all of those changes, this is where we are at the moment. Now in 2020, I was invited to make a contribution to a special edition to commemorate the life and work of VUYANI, an opportunity I could not resist, even though I was pretty busy with COVID-19 and all the added work and responsibilities given to the dean. I took on the challenge and I managed to publish a paper towards the end of 2020, which was titled "With a Black Theology of Liberation, Perspectives from the Late Professor VUYANI Vellem." For most part, VUYANI and I enjoyed many intellectual discussions on various topics. We agreed and sometimes disagreed on matters. After his passing, and in preparing for the article that I was about to write at that point in time, I then went through many of his publications. In fact, probably read all of them, if not most of them. And as I went through his publications, I was deeply touched by this really profound intellectual, extremely provocative thinker, and yet a very significant contributor to Black theology of liberation. In liberation theology and in all the other contextual theologies, he was an incredible contributor, but he was really known for his particular contributions in the Black theology of liberation. He was indeed a formidable voice on the subject and started to attract young scholars and students to think critically and prophetically with him. He opened new doors to critical engagement and a praxis-orientated theology, a theology of action and change. He saw new dimensions and discoveries and brought them into Black Theology of Liberation, calling indeed for radical transformation and reformation. He had an intolerable impatience for injustices and systems that fostered racism and oppression, and especially the oppression of Black people. Much of his academic contributions captures those struggles and expressions. I said in my article that when I think about VUYANI, I immediately think, gone too soon. And this is indeed the case. But thank God that his contributions in church, society, and academia still lives on in the hearts and minds of scholars, pastors, church leaders, family, and friends. And this we continue to enjoy and remember as we remember his contributions, especially in the field of justice and liberation. So this VUYANI Memorial Lecture is an important attempt to study, reflect, and build on what VUYANI has left behind. And I trust that we will do precisely that as we receive this lecture today from Dr. Collin Cowan and also the response that will follow. But if I could just briefly, very quickly introduce Dr. Collin Cowan to us before he speaks. Dr. Cowan is the former General Secretary of the Council for World Mission, which is a partnership of 32 churches across the world. Prior to coming to this post, he served as General Secretary of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, where he is currently based, of which he is an ordained minister. In his time as the CWM General Secretary, he led a dynamic team across 6 global regions united by the commitment to faith in God and to the service of the body of Christ and all creation. But apart from this brief introduction, I think the most important thing is that Collin knows VUYANI very deeply, very intimately. They have worked so many, many years on ecumenical issues, and VUYANI also gave a lot of his time to CWM in the work that they were doing, especially on justice issues and theological formation and discussions and dialogues. So it is really good to have Dr. Collin Cowan with us, and I'm going to give him the opportunity now to deliver his lecture, after which I will introduce the respondent. Thank you, Collin. Collin, you need to unmute.
There you go.
That's perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so very much. Greetings to you, sisters and brothers. I'm very pleased for this opportunity to join you. I echo the words of Professor Pillay just now, that VUYANI really went too soon. Maybe a little audacious for us to say that, because all things are in God's hand and God knows better than we do. But for us, in our liminal space, that's perhaps the only way we can put it. I greet you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and as a dear friend of VUYANI, Professor Vellem, my friend, my colleague and brother. I am both honored and grateful for this opportunity to reflect on the life and memories of my dear colleague, friend and brother, Professor the Rev Dr. VUYANI Vellem. In this first public lecture organized by the University of Pretoria in his memory. In all my association with VUYANI, we were simply known to each other as bro, short for brother. He was an academic of scholarly distinction with a vocabulary that mesmerized most of us. And yet his grace and humility enabled us to share some of the most intense conversations on a variety of subjects. I regard him as the restless, untamed, and untamable prophet of the South, with a consciousness for Blackness and the need for an affirmative epistemology in this regard that set him apart. He is described by the World Council of Churches in their tribute at the time of Professor Wellem's death, leading Black theologians of our times, who was well known for his contribution to public theology and liberation theologies. A very fitting tribute indeed. I commend the University of Pretoria under the leadership of the Dean of Theology and Religion, Professor Jared Pillay, for organizing this lecture in VUYANI's memory. In our several conversations about this subject, we have dreamed about ways to keep the memory of VUYANI alive in our consciousness and as a perpetual reminder for those who come behind us. And I pray that such dreams will come to fruition and that his legacies will live on in this university and beyond. I pay tribute to his dear wife, Unisa, and his two beautiful daughters, Namvuya and Felisa, for their love of and care of him throughout their lifetime together, and particularly during his illness. And I pray for their continued healing and readjustment to the life without him in the flesh. I know that he lives on in your memory and in your hearts, but you will continue to miss him in the flesh. He spoke well of you. He loved you all. And if there's any comfort in that, it is to say that you connected with him at a deep level and gave him wings to fly. I have chosen as a topic for this lecture, resisting the culture of silence and the conspiracy to silence, because of its currency for the times in which we are living, and because it speaks eloquently to the things against which VUYANI fought and the stance he took to defend the freedom and honor of the vulnerable and the dispossessed. His entire life was a testimony of resistance against injustice and of any attempt to silence the stories of those who felt its sting and knew its pain. Friends, we live in a world where it has become the norm to suffer in silence, to carry the burden of imposed shame and the pain of other people's prejudice, racism, and violence, all because it seems too risky to speak, either for self-preservation or the protection of the powerful and the privileged. This cruel culture of silence is perpetrated by the powerful, most often men, who scheme in silence to silence the vulnerable in order to maintain our positions of privilege. So let me try and set the context for this topic. Former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, resigned after numerous allegations of sexual harassment, having served as the 56th governor of New York for some 10 years. In speaking to his innocence, he acknowledged behavior that was inappropriate, but said this: in my mind, I have never crossed the line with anyone, but I didn't realize the extent to which the line has been redrawn. Cuomo is suggesting that this type of behavior came from a different era when these kinds of actions were acceptable. In truth, there has never been a time when it was acceptable for anyone to be touched or spoken to in ways that made them uncomfortable. The difference now is not that the boundaries have been drawn or redrawn where none existed before, but that more people are speaking up about their experiences and holding perpetrators accountable. That's perhaps the only difference between now and then. The culture of silence anywhere in the world is the veil that enables the powerful to exist under the illusion of invincibility in a world where all the rules are rewritten in their favor and everything and everyone exists for their amusement. This is particularly poignant in the story of the disgraced Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, who was convicted of sexual assault following the testimonies of over 80 women. The sad truth is that Mr. Weinstein's predatorial behavior was an open secret, even joked about openly. And yet it is reported that Harvey Weinstein has been thanked more times than God in the history of the Oscar acceptance speeches. The conspiracy to silence may linger for a while, and a culture of silence may fester. But there are when even the thickest of veils must come down. Derek Chauvin's conviction and sentencing to 22.5 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd reflected much more than an act of justice and accountability. It speaks to the breaking point of the collective psyche when the world unwittingly watched a man gasp for air for almost 10 minutes and finally died. Watched a man gasp for air for almost 10 minutes and finally died on camera. And the world was forced to search itself and respond to what it had just witnessed. What Derek Chauvin did was not a one-off isolated incident. The impunity with which he took a man's life is a testament to the fact that he was operating within a culture that has always tolerated it. In different ways and words, Chauvin can be heard saying, in my mind, I have never crossed the line with anyone, but I didn't realize the extent to which the line has been withdrawn. He didn't realize that the line of a Black man, that the life of a Black man mattered, not just to him, but to the world. He was genuinely surprised that when a long history of unchecked, genuinely surprised that with a long history of unchecked and unacknowledged acts of racially motivated violence and oppression against Black and brown people in the United States and around the world, the death of another would stir that much interest, and let alone he be condemned for it. Although the Me Too movement started in 2006, it was in 2017 that it really got its wings, when the magnitude of the problem of sexual violence hits survivors everywhere from all across the globe and gave them the confidence and the courage to claim their voices and to tell their story of Me Too. Resisting the culture of violence and the conspiracy to violence, women and men who suffered under the weight of silence and secrecy for years stood up and said that enough was enough. This message is gaining immense currency today, leaving many quivering and questioning past behavior. And I say this, that incidents of police brutality and racially motivated violence against Black people is that which lies behind the Black Lives Matter movement. It may have been triggered by the murder of an unarmed teenager, Trayvon Martin, and the unbelievable clearing of the officer who committed this heinous act. But at a deeper level, Black Lives Matter is the cry of a people no longer able to keep silent in the face and under the weight of injustice. I am painfully aware of how, notwithstanding personal pain as a result of systemic racism and organized, orchestrated violence, I too have been protected by this culture of silence, because I am among the privileged who benefited from patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia. I am also a leader within the church, where it is no longer any secret that the church is as guilty as any other group or organization that perpetrate and perpetuate silence to protect its image and its prized possessions at the expense of people's lives, hopes, and dreams. The horrible breaking news that some 216,000 children, I say that again, 216,000 children, mostly boys, have been sexually abused by clergy in the French Catholic Church since 1950. This is scandalous and painful. This cloud of secrecy, covering up deplorable behavior and protecting the church's hierarchy instead of the vulnerable, is not just to be found in the Roman Catholic Church. It is a condition that has plagued the whole church, calling its identity and its vocation into question. And this is not just about sexual abuse of children, but deeply entrenched in our distortion of scripture, it is also about violence against women and girls. It is about homophobia and our intolerance at the thought of embracing sexual diversity. It is about xenophobia, self-serving nationalism. It is about racism and racial prejudice and racially motivated violence. And yes, it is about silencing the voices of those who would dare to speak, denying many of the power of voice and the freedom to tell their stories of lived experiences. In a recent study on the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, Council for World Mission discovered, to its guilt and shame, that our antecedent body, the London Missionary Society, profited from its involvement in that slave trade, became complicit with its conduct, and as such contributed to the suffering and death of thousands upon thousands of Black people, the decimation of cultures, and the separation of families and peoples. As an organization, we continue to benefit from the sin of our foreparents, and we are no less guilty of that sin if we remain silent and pretend it away or seek to absolve ourselves of the responsibility to confess and repair the breach by generalizing it. So that's the context, and I turn now to living a theology of resistance and liberation, where I want to connect this context with VUYANI VELLEM. VUYANI stood tall as a restless prophet from the South, a son of South Africa soil, resisting this culture of silence and the conspiracy to silence. He was acutely aware of the context of empire in which we live, and therefore the quest for life-affirming epistemologies that are necessary for any meaningful engagement in such a context. He found resistance, which he also at times termed as insurrection, inextricably linked to resurrection, which is the anchor of our faith in Jesus. VUYANI claimed that there is an undeniable relationship between insurrection and resurrection. He also acknowledges the dangers of punishment and retribution that have always followed resistance to the status quo, which includes any theological approach that raises the consciousness of the oppressed. But what could be more inspiring a basis for all the struggles than a rebellion against the punishment of insurrection itself? In his Bible study submission in the Bible and Theology from the Underside of Empire, VUYANI asserts that while death is the inescapable punishment for the charge of insurrection, rebellion against death itself is ostensibly an inspiration of the same theological paradigm. Liberation theology has always been viewed with suspicion as disruptive and dangerous to the social and religious order and peace, and particularly to the social hierarchies that the conventional schools of theology seek to preserve. Why is this theological perspective so dangerous? In response, VUYANI shared insights by Miguel de la Torre that liberation theology is so dangerous because it disrupts a religious and political worldview that supports social structures that privilege the few at the expense of the many. Ignorance of the causes of oppression is crucial to maintaining this worldview. But as the consciousness of the oppressed begins to be raised, as they begin to see with their own eyes that their repressive conditions are contrary to the will of God, the power privilege of the few who benefit from the status quo is threatened. End of quote. VUYANI was unapologetically Black. He did not settle for language like a person of color, non-white, or just African. He was a Black African, biologically, anthropologically, and ideologically. He knew who he was, and he was not prepared to compromise on his identity to satisfy the culture where the urge for politically correct language silenced those who would venture to speak their truth and tell their story. He was Black, proud to be Black. Claiming Blackness as an ideological construct was crucial to him. He owned up to his own Blackness and refused to be silent or silenced by his more cautious friends and colleagues who preferred the tame language to define our narrative and lived experience. In With the Black Theology of Liberation, Perspectives from the late Professor VUYANI VELLEM, Professor Jerry Pillay observes that VUYANI's obsession with Blackness often earned him the criticism of being anti-white and of projecting racism in reverse. However, he was grossly misunderstood. VUYANI's focus on Blackness, Pillay aptly elucidates, was not on just pigmentation, but on the state of mind, of a consciousness and an existential project of Blackness. I agree. VUYANI was very mindful that, in his words, there is an intractable link between Eurocentric modernity, slavery, colonialism, Christianity, capitalism as constructs, or rather systems managed and enunciated to maintain the supremacy and superiority of one race, the white race. However, he was never convinced that because white people thought that to be so, that so it was. He resisted that lie, and like others, Nelson, Winnie Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Martin Luther King, and so many others, he fought for the equality of humanity. The affirmation of Blackness for him, therefore, was less about Blackness as an academic discipline, and more so very amply expressed by Anthony Reddy, a critique of white supremacy. That's what it was. In Hermeneutical Embers, Vellem observed that racial prejudice might be with us until Jesus comes again. But racism as a creation by human beings, like poverty, could be eradicated when the Blackness of humanity is affirmed for the humanity of all. I agree, and in so doing, I echo the words of Robert Nesta Marley, Bob Marley, and for him, Marcus Messiah Garvey, until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war. That until that day, dream of lasting peace, world citizenship, rule of international morality will remain but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. Now, everywhere is war. And until the ignoble and unhappy regimes that hold our brothers in Angola, in Mozambique, South Africa, subhuman bondage have been toppled, utterly destroyed, well, everywhere is war. Is there war? VUYANI was not just unapologetically Black. He was fiercely vigilant and untamable, a fiercely vigilant and untamable public theologian. VUYANI knew his own mind. He did not allow himself to be contained by conventional theology or sociology. He could not be entrapped or tangled by the imperial logic, and the word game of control could not beguile him. He was far too smart and self-assured for that. In my view, outrage was a calculated response for VUYANI. Outrage is that which springs from the bowels of discontent. Outrage is definitively defiant and subversive because it is about saying yes to God, as Bertil Taylor remarks. This is VUYANI's own reflection on the matter. Speaking at the Arusha conference on mission and evangelism, he said this: prayer is a subversive spiritual resource. It is a powerhouse of the liturgy that speaks back to tyrannical forms of power with unwavering faith in the God of life. Prayer is the liturgy that speaks back to tyrannical forms of power. By this statement, he argued that one cannot pray, one cannot worship and still be silent in the face of injustice. For him, it was a contradiction of terms. And as I ponder the fierce vigilance and untamable disposition of VUYANI VELLEM, I think of Martin Luther King Jr. On March 22, 1956, Martin Luther King was found guilty of leading an illegal boycott and was sentenced to $500 fine or 386 days in jail. Having settled the fine, he left the courtroom and he faced the crowd of supporters, of journalists, and of opponents alike. He said this as he faced that enormous crowd: I am proud, or rather, I was proud of my crime. I was proud of my crime. It was the crime of joining my people in a nonviolent protest against injustice, of seeking to instill within my people a sense of dignity and self-respect, of desiring of my people the unalienable rights of life, of liberty, and of the pursuit of happiness. It was above all the crime of seeking to convince my people that non-cooperation with evil is just as much a moral duty as is cooperation with good. VUYANI's life and work betrayed a passion for life that is flourishing for all. In his reflections on urbanization in post-1994 South Africa, he wrestles with the meaning of liberation and the differences evidenced in the ways development may be interpreted by Black South Africans vis-a-vis white South Africans. Whether it is to do with transportation, food, housing, or cultural expression, Vellem's concern is with the dignity and the quality of life for people in South Africa in general, and Black South Africans in particular, simply because, as he argues, with urbanization comes relocation, population density, displacements, and consequently vulnerability, destruction of the environment, and diminished quality of life for all. He was unhappy, even resentful, with the lack of structure in the way city centers were designed, and of the social stratification and marginalization that resulted. Well, this is the stuff of which resistance is made. And VUYANI demonstrated that he was not afraid to take this road of agitation, lonely though it was at times, and indeed it was lonely for him at times, this road of interrogating the racial, political, economic, and theological views that underpin the movement of Black Africans only as a means of cheap and docile labor, his words. And advocating for a post-apartheid way of life that honors the struggle for freedom and actually acknowledges that there are those who come away from the struggle into post-apartheid era with an understanding and an appreciation of the need to dismantle the colonial systems and its culture in order for true liberation to be achieved for all. And VUYANI was a restless prophet of liberation and hope. In all his writings and conversations, there was intentionality about engagement with context in which VUYANI was nurtured his own beloved South Africa. He engaged the issues, quarreled with its leaders, challenged his colleagues, and committed himself to the highest standard of discipline and accountability. He was an avid student of history and politics and of the sociology and theology that constituted the springboard for constructive critique and considered contribution to a life-flourishing existence. There was always something brewing in his mind. He was never content that enough was being done, never satisfied with platitudes and cliche, always of the view that there was something more to do. Language shrouded in ambiguity bothered him. He preferred prophetic witness to missional journey. Black people or white people spoke more clearly to him than a person of color. He was comfortable with language like white privilege and black power. He named things that for what they were, and he challenged us to rise above being sucked in or swallowed up by the culture of silence and conspiracy to silence. VUYANI knew very well that one way to tackle the giant is to become comfortable with the alternative, that justice is an imperative of faith, and that a mindset shift is the greatest slingshot to topple empire. In that regard, he was never content with things as they were. The anger and courage by which hope is defined according to St. Augustine aptly describes VUYANI VELLEM. In a tribute to him at the time of his death, CWM said it was his passion for justice, his commitment to life in fullness for all, his fierce opposition to the life-denying forces to holistic living, and his uncompromising and unapologetic stance to liberation theologies and the dignity of Black people that made him a leader among leaders in the struggle for peace and justice. VUYANI resisted the culture of silence and the conspiracy to silence. In so doing, he contributed to the public discourse on transformative praxis, where the hermeneutic of suspicion and the theology of resistance became inextricably intertwined and instructive to all of us who would dare to stand up and be counted. For example, it was with great passion that he addressed the 2016 Assembly of the Council for World Mission on the subject of healing the broken body, hope for renewal. At that time, he creatively connected life in 1976 to life in 2016 in South Africa. Speaking to the energy of the Soweto uprising, he said this: Black consciousness had taught that the articulation of a political situation effectively and well would not only result in Black people standing up against a violent system, but also would, through their solid unity, make the system and structures of white power to crumble. Once people's consciousness is alive, he said, people are able to stand up, and once they stand up in unity, they make powerful structures to crumble. Participation thus becomes an antidote to fear that stultifies human beings and turns them into patients of history. He rolls off these words off his tongue so easily. But he was buoyant with hope as he spoke these words, articulating his own conviction of what was needed to confront the system that kills, steals, and destroys, and uphold the life-giving alternative, But as he continued his presentation, he lamented. He lamented that 22 years since the demise of the apartheid in South Africa, the grievance that was made 40 years ago has resurfaced. South African students and young people in general throughout the higher education landscape are again saying, Africans must fall. A restless prophet of liberation and hope. He sees the problems, he knows the struggle, and he is ever prepared to face them with a view to rise to life and to claim the possibilities of the moment. That was VUYANI VELLEM. And he warned as prophets do. Anger, disappointment, disenchantment with promises unfulfilled. 20 years after democracy in South Africa, and 40 years at least since the eruption of fearless Black participation and the elevation of Black African culture, when social monuments, social rebellion, and social movements are throttled, when the struggle stalwarts and liberation icons become implementers of the neoliberal project, and when those entrusted with the hope of the broken body become fraudsters, visceral politics becomes inevitable. VUYANI VELLEM, a restless prophet of liberation and hope. And so I would like to issue a call for us to resist the culture of silence and the conspiracy to silence. Today, I invite us to honor the memory of VUYANI by resisting the culture of silence and the conspiracy to silence, because this culture and conspiracy are destined to kill, steal, and destroy hope and honor, to further the life-denying systems and to collude with empire at the expense of the poor, the dispossessed, and the downtrodden. If we refuse to resist this culture and expose the conspiracy, then those on the margins will forever remain there, stifled and suffocated by the strangulation of a broken system. And those silenced by the powerful and the privileged may be forced to bear the pain of isolation and the scandal of dishonor for far longer than is necessary. In 2 Samuel 13, we have the sordid story of how Amnon shamelessly raped, dishonored, and disgraced his own sister Tamar. But more, we learned how Absalom, another of her brothers, silenced her in the name of maintaining the honor and integrity of the family. The light was stolen from her life. She was robbed of her hopes and dreams. And the painful conclusion of the story is that she remained in Absalom's house, forlorn and desolate. Tamar resisted this cruel and unconscionable conduct on the part of her brother Amnon for as long as she could, but she was overpowered by the culture of silence and the conspiracy to silence, involving her own father, her brothers, and all who lived and worked in her father's house. Unfortunately, we cannot simply pass this off as something of the distant past. We all have countless stories of horrors, rape, murder, exploitation, xenophobia, homophobia, all of these and so much more happening right now in our communities. So let me conclude. I am encouraged that in striking contrast to the sordid story of Tamar and her family, Jesus' encounter with the woman accused of being caught in the act of committing adultery, and that of blind Bartimaeus, rebuked and pressured into silence by the disciples of Jesus as he begged to be heard by Jesus, tell different stories. In both cases, the broken and the vulnerable were given voice to tell their stories and freedom to walk with confidence into the open space of life's possibilities. Unlike the family of Tamar, who forced her into a life of desolation within a culture of silence, Jesus opened wide the door, gave the broken wings to fly, voice to speak, and by example, invited his community to see with sensitivity and to behave with care. But I also am touched by these words of lamentation spoken by Vellem as he wrestled with his beloved country in the post-apartheid era. We saw the process of negotiations in South Africa. He was sad. We yearned for a settlement proportionate to the injustices that were perpetrated against the broken bodies. He begged us to listen carefully and to allow him space to speak. He said that we learned nonetheless that compromise was a good lesson for all and embraced the new South Africa with an Madiba dance. We exposed the spirit that said, perhaps indeed negotiating justice required a virtue of patience, courage, and even tolerance. This we exposed and joined many in the hilarious and euphoric moment of transition in South Africa. To this euphoric moment, he said, we must add the fact that we became silent when the word Ubuntu was removed from the Constitution. My friends, may we never again become silent when our speaking matters. To this, Vellem's words reverberate. Religious untruth surely must be told when the slitting of a human throat and the massacre of mine workers, such as the one we saw in South Africa, becomes a ritual. Untruth must be told when faith is captured to scare people and promise them good life after death. Untruth must be told to tame the rebellion, the resurrection power of Jesus, anastasis, which remains the true path to the salvation of the victims of vicious systems of world and the groans of creation. Words that only a prophet can speak. And to this I say, amen. So let it be. Friends, I thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Colin. I will return to say an appropriate thanks at the end. Just for the sake of time, we want to move on quickly. Colleagues, for the rest of the program, we have a respondent, just one person that will give us a response to the lecture. And then after that, we will actually have a time for question and answers. And that session will be moderated by Stefan de Beer, who is the director of the Center for Faith and Community. So our respondent is Dr. Lorato Okwena. Lorato joined our university faculty as a staff member in August this year, but she has been long acquainted with our faculty as a student. In fact, Lorato is one of the great success stories of one person who actually came to the university and in 2014 completed a diploma in theology and eventually in 2020 completing a PhD in the field of Old Testament studies. She's currently employed as a senior lecturer in the Department of Religion Studies and also partly in Old Testament studies. And she's helping us to actually dialogue and connect with issues of religion, but also bringing in experience as a Black woman and also helping us with issues of understanding Black liberation theology as well. She's actually quite a prominent person in the Mail and Guardian. She was nominated, or he'd actually elected as one of the top 200 young South African women in the field of education as a top priority in terms of that. But also in 2020, she was actually appointed as in the top 100 young, most influential South African women, young South African women in advanced media. And this year, 2021, she's actually been nominated for the top 50 achievers, and that's quite a record. We're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that the nomination will turn out into a reality. And congratulations to her for all these achievements. Lorato, it is my pleasure to invite you to give a response.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to my Dean, Professor Jerry Pillay. And thank you to Dr. Cowan for that poignant assessment of the archive that exists of Professor VUYANI VELLEM. Professor VUYANI VELLEM taught me in undergrad, as it has been said.
Lorato, 1 second, can I just interrupt you, Lorato? Just for the sake of time as well, if anybody's got a question that you wanted to pose either to Colin or to Lorato afterwards, you can use the chat box, and Lance and Stefan will be monitoring that for us as well. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem, Dean. Professor VUYANI VELLEM taught me in undergrad. It's still very difficult to talk about VUYANI today without having a lump in my throat. But although his material body is no longer inhibited, we believe that he's still amongst us. But just for the sake of time, I've been just tasked to give just a short response, just a few sentences to just echo the thoughts of Reverend Dr. Cowan. And once again, thank you for that poignant assessment of this culture of silence that we seemingly have resigned ourselves to. And Dr. Cowan characterizes this brute nature of this culture as the veil that enables the powerful to exist under the illusion of invincibility in a world where all the rules are rewritten in their favor and everything and everyone exists for their amusement. And this is tantamount to what King Lear said, that like flies to wanton boys, we are for the gods, they kill us for their sport. This clarion call that Dr. Cowan makes invokes the principles that VUYANI VELLEM stood for and reminds me of what Amir Sisse said in his resignation letter to Maurice Thorez, that no doctrine is worthwhile unless rethought by us, rethought for us, converted to us. And this unwillingness to rethink and convert is because of the double nature of proximity. Proximity both preserves and destroys. Those who want to resist this culture and speak first want to bargain and exchange their amnesty for loyalty. And this invisible economy exists and is enabled by a culture of fraternity. The ruse of analogy has been determined. Hence, there won't be an attempt on my part to do that. VUYANI also contested this as he speaks about redirecting the gaze. Although ontologically we have no resistance as fungible and disposable objects, because our existence frames the borders while humanity is at the center, and we have borrowed institutionality allotted to us by the landlords of humanity, VUYANI then invokes umoya, the breath of life, a hermeneutical rapture, and principle which exists to guide and shape our lives, a process of unthinking sensibilities of integralism, of psychological and ideological confusion, racism, classism, and gender-based violence. Umoya is rising in the spirit of forgiveness, coaxing and persuasion without forgetting the devaluing and suppression of the Black people. Umoya then becomes the creative participation of Black people with dignity as architects of life, with God, the architect of life. May the spirit of VUYANI VELLEM live forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorato. Thank you again, Colin. My name is Stefan de Beer. I'm humbled to have been asked by Professor Pillay to just facilitate the conversation. We have 20 minutes or so for that. As Jerry said right in the beginning, our centers came together a little bit more than a year ago, and almost every day we are still missing the opportunity to foster and to steward that which we had dreamt about together. but we are very committed to continue to learn from the legacy of VUYANI and those influenced by him. So thank you so much. Colin spoke. I'm not going to repeat it because we had to, but I mean, challenged, silencing the vulnerable to remain in our position of privilege, the disruptiveness of liberation theology, which dominant schools of theology still seeks to resist. And in speaking of the life and work of VUYANI as a critique of white supremacy, a commitment to a new humanity, a practice of calculated outrage, of subversive prayer, and so many other things. Thank you for opening this conversation for us. And thank you, Lerato, for your brief response, and looking also forward to working closely with you in our faculty. I'm inviting you now. I see there is a first question. I would just want to open up the conversation. You can either offer just a comment in the chat room if you want to, just in ongoing memory of VUYANI, if it's not a question, or a comment to affirm or to speak to what you heard from either Colin or Lerato. If you have a question, please also put it. It's a bit difficult with 75 people to see hands, so it will also help if you can just show your or just put your question in the chat, and I'll make sure. And Lance, just help me if I miss anybody. I think the first question, I just have to see here, is from Kunzi. Was naming of things as he saw them the reason many couldn't receive what he stood for? Is naming things as they are a problem? I find it difficult to follow here. A problem to the oppressors. Vellem named things unapologetically as he saw them. Colin, do you want to respond to that question?
Well, I think I agree that VUYANI was not afraid to name things as he saw them. We had several debates around those questions because he was fierce and vigilant in naming things. He felt that we should not cover up, we should not use language that veil the truth. But the truth is usually very difficult to hear. So I do agree that much of the loneliness that he also experienced, and I mentioned that the path was lonely for him at times. Lonely from his church, lonely from the academia, lonely from his friends, because we found it difficult to embrace the honesty with which he spoke things as they were. But that was who he was, and that's what gave him the cutting edge, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's continue to be in conversation. It's wonderful to see all the diverse people in this group from different places in the country and different institutions, from the grassroots and the academy and the church, which again just testifies to the kind of life, in-between kind of life that we are in. Please, if there are other comments, questions, it will be great to see them. Maybe whilst people are, I hope people are still going to raise questions or comments. Can I just, whilst we wait, Colin, do you want to say something more about, I was just struck by this one line of you, and I don't quote you verbatim, but you spoke of the disruptiveness. Sorry, already I'll give you a chance now. Let me just raise this quickly. The disruptiveness of liberation theology, which often still get resisted by dominant schools of theology. Do you want to say one or two more sentences about that challenge? And then I will ask Mareri to raise her question. Her hand is up.
In many ways, what we often regard as systematic theology could also be regarded as European or Eurocentric theology. If theology were to be regarded as contextual. And VUYANI was clear that his context shaped his own theological worldview, that his context with all the issues that surrounded him became the basis for theologizing, and therefore liberation theology came out of his own wrestling, his own struggling with South Africa, his context, and Blackness as he experienced it, the ideology of Blackness, which, as Anthony Reddy says, that it is a significant contrast. It's a critique of white supremacy more than it is anything else. So if one were to look at how the world is shaped and what are the ideologies that shape our thinking, we have to agree that this whole question of liberation theologies is at the heart of context of people's struggle and people's pain and people's aspiration for a better life. And sometimes it is difficult to understand that because people claim that there is no system at all in this. It's perhaps people just talking. But whilst I do agree that we may not want to talk so much about a Black theology, but more like a Black liberation theology, as Jerry put it in his paper, I think that the constant tension about what constitutes a conventional theology that can be embraced by all of us, and what constitutes the disruptive, radical theologies that are more related to people's struggle and people's context, is also related to the fact that many of us are not prepared to listen to each other and to listen to the pain and the struggle that we feel. So that's what I was trying to capture as I listened to VUYANI over and over again. I think he was dissatisfied with the fact that so many people refused to enter the space of others as they struggle with their situation and look for liberation.
Well, thanks, Colin. The failure to listen and enter the pain of the other. CWM Maredi, your hand is up, please. If you can raise your question, just turn off your mic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Collin, for the lecture. And in the spirit of breaking the silence and just commenting on Dr. Lerato's, the erection of the spirit of Umoya. I think I have a question. I think it's rather more directed to probably the dean of the faculty at the university. I'm wondering, because I mean, I'm a former student of the faculty myself, and I was taught by Professor Vellem, and I was introduced to Black liberation theology only in the later stages of my theological education. So my question is rather more curriculum based. I'm just wondering what the faculty is doing. I mean, I haven't been there since 2015, but I'm just wondering how they are integrating or implementing.
Sakuma, we miss you now. I don't know.
Able to hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah. As I was saying, that my question is rather more curriculum intended. I'm wondering, because my introduction to Black liberation theology was only later in my theological studies. So I'm wondering how the faculty, in the honor of Professor VUYANI Vellem, is integrating Black liberation theology, or if they do have plans of implementing Black liberation theology, the theme earlier on in their curriculum, because I think to only learn of it later on is in itself, to certain degrees, an injustice, especially that we are, or rather institutions of higher education are tasked to provide a more contextual theology. So my question, I'm not sure if Dr. Collin, you're able to answer this, but perhaps maybe the Dean would be able to respond to my question. Thank you. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Maradi, for that question. I think it's an important question. Yes, you was there, as you said, in 2015. And I can assure you that much has actually changed since then. We have certainly put Black liberation theology into the curriculum. And it's in different years. It's not just in the late part of one's academic career. It's right from the beginning and goes through. We've always also made some very concerted efforts in terms of employing Black academic staff who are actually focusing on Black liberation theology and so forth. And so it is very much, it's not quite fully where we'd want it to be, but I would say that it is very much more active in terms of teaching and part of being part of the curriculum itself. So we're developing these things, and actually, I think we're really moving in a direction where it becomes a very central part of our faculty's teaching content.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Pillay. Thanks, Akuma. That's a very important question. Do we leave Black liberation, womanist, feminist theologies to the individuals, and then sometimes we hate them for their honesty and critique? Or do we allow their voices to disrupt us sufficiently so we can also be transformed? Lance is saying, I met him too late and sat at his feet too little. Joel raised this question, is blackness about race? Colin, if you want to come in, even Leratu, is it about race? No, is blackness about race?
Leratu, you want to take the question? That's okay.
You can take it, Doc. I'll follow.
Okay. Well, Marcus Messiah Garvey, and so many others, have argued that there should just be one race, that is the human race. And wouldn't life be much easier if we could literally embrace all people as one race, as the human race, because that's what it was meant to be. But blackness will have to be regarded as a race ideologically. It's in a sense, what we call black and brown is sometimes skewed as well. So it is the ideology of supremacy that is at play here. The fact that white privilege, white supremacy, white superiority, which Willem speaks so much about as well. The fact that those exist and that the life for all of us is ordered around this notion that one race, that white people are superior to black people, and therefore they are supposed to enjoy certain privileges that black people cannot enjoy. That's what brings about this thing called black race and white race, whatever that means. So it is the ideology of blackness that we're talking about more than the anthropology or the biology of pigmentation.
Thank you for that. Fundiswa is just saying, it is such a great joy to listen to the one who has journeyed with Prof. Vellem and knows him so well. Thanks, Dr. Cowan. Fundiswa, our colleague and friend at UNISA. Another question from Joel, is liberating the oppressed not a potential of oppressing the oppressor, if not done carefully? That's an interesting question. Let's hear again from you, Colin.
The oppressed is not capable of oppressing the oppressor. All systems and structures are designed by oppressors to keep the oppressed subjugated. It is then we talk about reverse racism. That is also not possible unless we were prepared to rearrange all of the social and economic systems and turn that over to black people. Only then you could talk about that kind of reversal. So I agree that it is important that in articulating our pain and our struggle, that we are mindful that we're not now talking about people as we're talking about system. And once we get that clear, then we know that all people must join together in fighting oppression and fighting systems of oppression. So where I think we have got it wrong on so many occasions is that our focus has been on individuals, individual white people, individual Black people. What I think we need to wrestle with is the systems that have made us, the systems that have landed us in different camps, the privileged and the underprivileged. If that's what we're fighting, then that's a combined fight. As we saw, for example, the death of George Floyd, it was not just Black people who were chanting that Black Lives Matter. It was white people and brown people. It was everybody coming together, rallying to say this is an injustice that cannot be tolerated. And so I don't think that the fight is a fight for one set of people. It's a fight for all of us to chant down Babylon, to chant down oppressive systems and structures, and to create an arena in which all of us can live and play together. So I don't really know that the weak, the vulnerable, the dispossessed has the power and the means to destroy the oppressor, except that with a mindset, as I spoke earlier, with a mindset that says that we will not accept this, we can begin to topple the systems and create a better playing field for all people.
Thank you. That, of course, all these questions and all these comments would have been great if we were in the same space and could spend much more time and so on. So next time, Colin, that would be wonderful. We have about 4 minutes before I have to pass back to Prof. Pillay. Lukikilu is the first time I call you that, Credo. Lukikilu Mangai, also from UNISA. He says, VUYANI VELLEM located Black Theology of Liberation as a tool for cracking the white, sorry, I'm just struggling with the reading of, for cracking the Western code to break the coalition of Black experience with a white power structure. Sorry, it's the way this thing is said. I can't read the, can somebody read that question, because I'm struggling to read the full question.
Yes, I can help you with that. So what
Please.
should be done to integrate such an insight into theological education for the global South?
Oh, sorry, you're already further down.
No, I think that was the last part of that same one.
Oh, I see. Okay. Colin, did you follow that one?
Yes, I followed the question. Jerry, I think you already started answering that question, eh? But let me just comment, and perhaps you can take up. Some of the conversations that Professor Pillay and myself have had, for example, when we started talking about this lecture, is whether, for example, this could become, for example, an annual lecture in memory of VUYANI. But we were trying to push the boundary a little further to say, for example, whether a chair could be established at the University of Pretoria that focuses on Black liberation theology. And my thing is that such a conversation ought to continue. And we need to see whether or not there's a way, for example, to bring mission agencies like the Council for World Mission in partnership with the university to begin to talk about how this question finds currency in the global South. Already CWM started a process, for example, where we have done a series of books on what we call Prophets from the South. The first was a tribute to Alan Bosak as a distinguished scholar and prophet of resistance from South Africa. But we have gone around and we have done about 5 books on the subject so far. So the material is everywhere, but I think that it would be good for this to be established someplace where a chair is deliberately established to focus on Black liberation theology and contextual theologies in ways that help people to wrestle with their own struggle. But Jerry, you want to speak?
Yeah, sure, I think so. Absolutely. Maredi actually asked the question earlier with regards to Black theology and Black theology of liberation and what we're doing with it. The idea is to actually start a chair in the Center for Faith and Community. And we've been talking about that. We're trying to find funding for that. because my important quest is never to lose sight of Black theology, Black liberation theology, contextual theology. It must be integrated in the life and work of the faculty. And the center has become the space in which we're actually making this possible. So yes, Colin is absolutely correct. He and I have been over a year now, since actually VUYANI's passing, been discussing the possibility of a chair for Black Theology of Liberation. And this is part of this lecture, for example, is going to be an annual lecture as we celebrate the life of VUYANI and what he has left behind. But also it is an intention to carry through what he has left with us in terms of developing understandings of Black liberation theology. So yes, this will continue, and we hope to find funding for that, and we hope to start that chair when that becomes practically possible.
There's I think three last, because the time is then running. There are three last questions still, and there's actually four or three and a comment. If you can help us, Colin or Lerato, very briefly. There's a question from Lerato Kobe speaking about mental illness, the mental well-being of Black people in certain spaces, where there's where people suffer in silence. Do you want to comment to Lerato and that issue that she's raising, which is a very critical issue?
Yes, I'm just reading the question as how we as Black people suffer in silence, because you will find in an institution, a Black theologian, for example, stands alone in almost everyone, that they can affect our health. How do we as Black people connect to each other and from spaces in different institutions? I think this is a problem that we face. And also I think it speaks to resistance in institutions where it would rather be you than us. We would give it to you than rather we do it. And that resistance of not wanting to be involved in dialogues, to discourse, and the resistance to not want to face oneself as well. And this is why it's often relegated to the phenotypically apparent. Black people will do Black theology. And I think this is where the problem lies, because we're supposed to be engaging in these dialogues as a collective. And it does contribute to mental health, because for Black people, activism is not a choice. We are thrown into it. And that on its own is a heavy burden to carry. And when also when you speak of mental illness and mental health, even our own suffering as Black people then becomes mental wellness for the rest of the world, because we have to suffer and we have to dig into these archives, and it often becomes triggering. I remember once a colleague said, it was in a previous year or so, a colleague said that they wrote 6 or 7 articles in a year. And one colleague said, it's because you are white. You don't have anything to worry about in the world. So you have all the time to sit and write. So writing for us, engaging with the archive, becomes an exercise that triggers us, where we have to confront these colonial and decolonial realities. And so we should privilege our own. We should create systems and structures where we engage each other in safe spaces, where we can be able to form an archive, and that archive can be some sort of writing ourselves into existence and as a form of resistance as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lerato. There's so much there that we need more time for. There's 2 last brief questions and then a final comment, and then I will give to Jerry. Maybe linking to what Lerato just said, Colin, or Lerato, Jan is asking, what theology do we need to embrace? Do we need to embrace the whole humankind? New systems that's not caught up in either liberation or oppression. Colin, you want to try and?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question. I would argue that theology of liberation may be what is needed to address the question. But let me just say this. I don't believe the fight is a fight against white people or a fight against Black people. I think the fight has to be a fight for the integrity of the human race, for us to do that, it is important for us to name the problem. And the problem of racism, the problem of racially motivated violence and oppression, the problem of white supremacy and superiority are real. Those must be named for what they are. We have to also be prepared to unmask the injustices that have been veiled in silence and secrecy for all this time. That has to be unmasked. We have to be prepared to confess where we have gone wrong. And that's a confession that together, I mean, Council for World Mission is presently having a debate about whether we should make an apology about our involvement in the transatlantic trade in Africans. Now, our documents show that the London Missionary Society was involved, became complicit with its conduct, and profited from that slave trade. Now, you can't just wash that away as if to say it never happened. If we are going to continue to witness with integrity, we have to be prepared to name that and to confess that as an organization, we have sinned. We have contributed to the pain and the suffering of significant numbers of people around the world. Now, that is not just a cause for white people, it's a cause for all of us together as an organization. So when people ask, for example, well, who is going to apologize and to who? We say, well, it is the Council for World Mission that needs to apologize. It's the Council for World Mission who is continuing to benefit from the involvement of our foreparents in this act. So once we are doing that, then the whole question of reparation, and you know that the root for reparation is to repair. So it is this act of repairing that I think matters, because in the act of repairing, what we're really trying to see, is it possible for us to bring people together again from across the strains of divide? How possible is it for us to embrace a theology that opens up space, that opens up the door for all people to come together? That is the ultimate aim of healing, restoration, renewal, transformation, bridging of the divide, so that together we may live as one human family. So for me, that is what is, we have to wrestle with that question. But at the end of the day, what is going to matter is that we don't cover anything under the rug, that we don't become silent when we need to speak up, that we are open enough, like VUYANI was, to name things as they were, and then to say, now having named it, how do we move forward? What we call that theology, I really don't know, but I think it is more than urgent and necessary.
The very last question, that is again another interesting big topic, but Joel Mayepu is asking, do we also then need a white theology of liberation? Colin, Laratu.
One of the distinguished professor, I just remember his name now, from South Korea, he said this once he was speaking about empire, and in trying to make the point that he was not simply talking about white people and black people in contention. He says, I would like one day to be in the company of my white friends from the United States of America, because I have many of them there. I would just like to sit with them over coffee, and I want to ask them only one question. The question is this: are you happy with what is going on in the world? Are you happy with what is going on in the world? And that for me is the question. If we are happy with what is going on in the world, chances are we shouldn't talk about Black Lives Matter. We should talk about all lives matter. We shouldn't talk about violence against women. We should talk about violence against all people. We should not talk about violence against the LGBTQ community. We should talk about violence against all sexual preferences. The point I'm making is that the only reason that we are having this conversation around Blackness and Black liberation theology is because of how the hostile history has treated us and where it has landed us as a people, not just Black people, but white people as well. So if you go for white liberation theology, I don't know whether that answers the contextual realities that we're wrestling with. But maybe the question about, are you happy with what's going on in the world, may help us to make a considered decision about whether, in fact, if we're going to talk about Black liberation theology, we should also be talking about white liberation theology. My own personal view is that that's a moot question, because in many ways already it is the case that much of the theologies that inform our thinking is from the perspective of the white, even the way we read scripture.
Tapelo, are you still on the, I wonder if Tapelo, do you want to just read? Are you willing for me to put you on the spot and read it's the final comment? You've written a little beautiful paragraph there, Tapelo. And then I can pass back to Prof. Pillay. Would you be willing to do that? Pillow's maybe not hearing me. So she was just saying, thank you for the beautiful presentation. I'm glad Provido helped find my voice. And as Dr. Fundiswa always says, now I'm going to mess this up, Ilelinje Uyateta. Thank you. And there was one last message. I think it's from Fundiswa. Tapelo, he is our ancestor, and Laratu, a true ancestor for us all. Thank you, all of you, for the contributions, the questions, the comments, and the participation tonight. And I'm giving back to Professor Pillay to close our time.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Colin, when we had the initial difficulty of trying to connect with you, I thought that plan B was for me to read your paper. And I realized then that I will not do justice to us as much as you would. And indeed, you have done exactly that. And the absolute passion that you bring into your presentations, and especially today, I think the topic that you've chosen with regards to this first lecture is just so pertinent and so descriptive of the life of the late Professor VUYANI VELLEM. Resisting the culture of silence is something that he did so emphatically. Resisting empire, resisting oppressive systems, systemic racism, all of those things, affirming Blackness, are all the things that he has done in his writings, in his discussions, in his presentations, in his contributions, both in the church, in society, and even in academia. And I really think that you've done such a wonderful job in putting together the description and life of VUYANI, knowing him as a person, knowing him in the way that you have come to know him in the ecumenical setup and circles over the years, and especially with his work with CWM. And I think you've just captured him so beautifully in terms of how you presented his life, and as you said, those different points about him as a person and about his life and contributions. So tonight, I want to say that you've done absolute justice to this very first lecture, and I want to thank you most sincerely for making yourself available. We know that Jamaica's got 7 hours of time difference, but fortunately we are ahead of you. So you're somewhere in the middle of the day now. And you've really done a good job for us as we expected. And we want to express our sincere thanks to you for taking the time for preparing this, even in transition, moving from Singapore to Jamaica, and yet finding time to do this for us. We really, really are grateful and thankful to you for this today. And also to say thank you to Larato for a brief but very insightful input in terms of responding, but picking up on the concept of umoyo and how we can understand that in terms of developing even our concept and understanding of Black Theology of Liberation. Larato, thank you so much for coming in to this platform and for making that contribution in a very brief way, but yet very powerful way. We really sincerely appreciate it. Again, wants to say a very special thank you to Mrs. Vellem and family for making themselves available today for this particular memorial lecture. Without them, we would be amiss and we would be losing out significantly, because their presence here on this platform is so important to all of us. As we remember VUYANI, we touch base with the physical presence of them, but today it's virtually. The next time, perhaps, we will do it physically. So thank you to the Vellem family for being part of this and for the support that you've been giving us, not only as a faculty, but in many other different ways. We sincerely appreciate it. And then my thanks goes to Stefan as the director of the center, and Lance and Esmery for the wonderful work in putting this particular platform together for us, and for all the preparations that went behind the scenes. Thank you so much for the work you've done. And finally, I'd like to say a great big thank you to all of you who have been with us. I know we've lost some people in the process, but very few indeed. And thank you for staying with us for the full duration, and for listening in, and for also the contributions that you made in the chat room, and for listening and understanding in terms of the development of the topic that we've been speaking about today. So you've made this successful, and I want to say thank you to all of you for your presence. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for this opportunity to be together and to actually celebrate and commemorate the life of the late Professor VUYANI Vellem in this very first lecture of our faculty. Thank you very much. Take care and keep well.